Okay, hello and welcome everyone to part 3 of the Introduction to Conscious Editing series presented by the Sunshine State Digital Network. I'm Kayla Sayas-Ruiz and I am the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator. We want to thank everyone for coming today. Today's presentation will be recorded and we have enabled automatic transcription. So if you would like live transcription on your screen, you can just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please excuse any errors as it is automated. We will hear from 3 facilitators today. Our facilitators are Itza Gadbahan. She's a doctoral student at the University of Washington School of Information. Bets Cope, the processing archivist at Houghton Library at Harvard University. And Jessica Tai, resident processing archivist at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this third section of the SSDN's Introduction to Conscious Editing series. As Kayla explained, my name is Bets Cope, and it's an honor to speak with you all today with my fellow presenters, and to follow 2 powerful and thought-provoking earlier sessions in this series. Today, we are closing out this series with what is hopefully a pragmatic and useful workshop on planning and managing projects to do conscious and inclusive editing and description of archival materials. As you all know, this work is crucial for creating accurate and accessible description that we know cannot and should not be written neutrally, but instead in recognition of our own positions and the positions of the individuals, families, and groups whose materials and histories we describe. I would like to quote Stephen G. Fullwood from an interview he did with Stephen D. Booth for 60 Inches from Center. Processing a collection is a form of storytelling in and of itself, providing access for researchers and simultaneously planting seeds for stories wanting to be born. It's a generative practice, very fluid and inspiring and inherently political. I think this is not just true of processing, it's true of any archival descriptive work. We do redescription and conscious editing to make certain that stories are told accurately and honestly, the materials are described in such a manner that they can be sought and found by the communities that created them, and that we reduce the dominance of privileged people in our collections. To give you a brief idea of what we'll be doing today, the 3 of us will present to you about planning a project of this kind, advocating for the time, resources, and labor necessary to do this work carefully and correctly, and developing guidelines and resources for undertaking redescription projects and beyond. After we each speak to you about these topics, we will offer the chance to move into 3 different breakout rooms for which you previously registered for 30 minutes of discussion on the topics. Finally, we'll conclude as a group with a joint final Q&A period to finish out the workshop. So with all of that in mind, I will turn it over to Itza, who will speak about how to get started planning a project of this kind.
So funny, I was muted. Let me start again. Hi, everyone. Thank you to Kayla and Bets for getting us started. My name is Itza Garbajal, and I'll be talking about, just diving right in. What do you need to do? How do you get this started? And what sort of things do I encourage you to think about before you start a project of this kind? So here's a little bit of bio about myself. I'm currently a doctoral student at the University of Washington. Previous to that, I was working as a contractor at the University of Texas at Austin, working with the Lilas Brengen Latin American Studies and Special Collections as a Latin American metadata librarian, focused specifically on post-custodial projects in Latin America. So a little bit about this section, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking to y'all about just kind of like very overview strategies and tips on things that you should consider when thinking about starting these kinds of projects. But before I do that, I do want to talk a little bit about, what I bring to this conversation, what sort of perspectives and experiences that influence how I work, because that's very important when thinking about redescription, and in particular when you're describing either topics or people that you may not have any sort of direct relationship with. In my case, I am born in the United States, parents from Honduras in Central America. So I've always kind of lived between these two different worlds, but I've been raised, and I continue to expand on the idea that, like, just because I have entry to certain communities doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always welcomed in certain communities, or that I have the privilege of being able to speak for certain communities or on behalf of certain communities. I am multilingual, and so I do always incorporate that into my metadata work, and really trying to decenter any sort of monolingual, monocultural approach to either description work or any sort of cultural memory work as well. Let's see if this works. Did it do it? There we go. Okay. So kind of like in the big scheme of things, scoping a project or getting a project started, some of these areas might sound familiar to you. So, you know, when you're thinking of starting a project, you'll likely think about the typical aspects of project planning, right? We see articulating a focus, which is obviously the first start. If you don't know what your focus is, probably don't know what your project is. But that will always be kind of like the future pathway to give you direction as to whether what kind of decisions you'll likely be making and what sort of expectations you'll be placing on yourself as well as on others. Other areas you'll likely have focus on include like specific work tasks, goals, and deliverables. But I do want to mention that it is important that with redescription work, in particular redescription work that is either term conscientious or justice oriented or ethical, this isn't a product focused kind of work. So these questions shouldn't be kind of like your central focus, and they shouldn't be the end all be all. Rather than thinking about what you will produce, whether that's like a robust new data set or a series of metadata records, these sort of redescription projects should really be viewed as like a pathway towards continued or more holistic work that goes beyond a thing. So this is where timelines also matter, because these help you kind of align your work with the work of others or efforts that will continue beyond this project. And alongside timelines, you'll want to also deeply reflect and consider both the assumptions you carry into your work as well as the potential risks the project might produce or surface. And then lastly, I want to make sure that you think about everyone that will be part of this project as well as those that might be impacted by the work or the outcomes of the project. See. Okay. So here, kind of gone into a little bit more specifics about starting a project. We're still thinking about scope. We're still thinking about questions that we should be asking ourselves even prior to getting the stuff started, right? And I'll always encourage you to start with what I think is the most important question that needs to be answered before moving forward with the project is, why are you doing this? In particular, if it's a redescription work, is it to right a past wrong, or is it to increase access to collections and materials? Is it to resolve disputes, or is it to update inaccuracies? And while other people might see these projects again as products or deliverable driven, this is not the mindset that will facilitate a conscious or ethical or justice oriented effort. But whatever your response may be, just make sure to have that asked, or to make sure that your leadership knows that these are the kind of questions that you're asking prior to starting a project, just to make sure that your focus, their focus, and the focus of everyone that's going to be involved in the project is at least aligned from the beginning. So during these early stages, you'll also consider what you and your team have capacity for. This is going to be really important because it's going to also define like the scale of your project. Will you and others be working on this project full-time? Is it going to be part-time? Is it going to be a mix? Will people come in with previous experience, or will they need some sort of metadata training? Are there any connections or prior exposure to topics or subjects that the project will focus on? Is this project going to be a priority, or does it align with other ongoing projects like digitization or transcription work? Aligning your projects with other projects is also very helpful to narrow down timelines to kind of understand if you have to finish a project in order for somebody else to start, or will somebody be able to kind of lay the groundwork for your work to then be easier in the future, whether that's through community building or say understanding like the scope of your collection so you don't have to do such extensive research when it comes down to your part of the project. Also thinking about, can you align yourself with other historic sort of anniversaries or commemorations, or is there something going on in your community, say like some sort of event has occurred and there's a need for some community trust building. Really think beyond the deadlines of a grant cycle and really make the grant cycle work for you. And so here are a couple of other questions that I think are really important to either answer or to just kind of think about, bring to your team. And this is around, project scoping is really knowing what you have to work with, right? So in the case of redescription work, this will likely revolve around what kind of collections do you have? What kind of materials do you have? What is the content of your materials? What is the context? Ask yourself, what is the reach or the intended audience of your collection? Who uses your collection now? Who doesn't use your collection? Who could use it in the future? And also think about, well, why, if you have, say, like a dissonance between people that you would want to use your collection, but they're not using your collection, really think about why. Think about the state of the metadata in particular. So I think about not just like the abstract state of like, well, what kind of words are being used, but also like, what kind of format is it? Or even like, what does it look like? Is it complete? Is it incomplete? Does it exist? Is it outdated? Is it technically obsolete? Or is it stuck in like old formats that just are no longer usable to you or to the systems that you and your users are expecting to use? And then think about the future. So what is the future impact of your collection and the work that you'll be doing? Who might benefit from the work that you'll be doing, but then also who could be harmed, right? It's not necessarily assuming that all the work that we do is good by default, or that having good intentions is enough and then that's going to produce good results, but knowing really that intentions will always have impact, and impact might be perceived as good or bad by others. And then lastly, I'll mention that as this is a kind of reparative or liberatory or restorative metadata work, as it gains attention, whether that's based on the archival literature or the field, as a general direction that we're trying to move more in this space of not doing work just for the sake of work. It's really important for you and your team to stay up to date on what people are saying, what people are writing, what people are doing, and also contribute back. So if you're doing really important work, make sure to share that out, not just with your local institution or your team, but to share that out with your regional groups, your local groups, because this work can't be done in isolation. It might be being done in isolation right now, but eventually if we're trying to be able to like have these workshops and share these skills and insights and move forward as a community, we need to talk to each other. And so I'll wrap it up with my favorite topic, labor. So I did mention that I was a precariously employed contract grant employee. I was hired as a metadata practitioner on exclusively digital collections. And so I'm not a fan of that labor model at all. And in particular, when thinking about trying to do metadata work that is both robust as well as continuous, so meaning going beyond the end of a project, I'll really just stress here that you need to think about your team, not only think about like what sort of skills do they have, what sort of experience do they have, because again, oftentimes those questions really kind of bottleneck you into saying like, well, what's the best product that I can produce? But think more about, how can I invest? How can I nurture? How can I support the next generation of metadata practitioners? What do they need to do? What do they need to know? What do they need in order to be able to succeed and to continue this work? Because if I'll tell you right now, if the case continues where we're just hiring lots of people and training them to do this really important description or redescription work, and then they leave not only our institutions, but they leave our projects, they leave our teams because we don't have work for them beyond the scope of a project, we're never going to be able to create an environment, not only for ourselves, but for our community to be able to continue this work, to do it well, and then to learn from it, and then continue to be able to expand from there. So ask yourself, what will remain after the end of your project? And so with that, I'd like to welcome my other co-presenter, Beth, back, and I hope to see you at the breakout room.
Hi, everyone. I am here to talk to you all about advocacy, thinking about time, staff, and resources and how you advocate for that to do this kind of project. But before I get into that, I want to recognize my position as I do this work as a white cishet woman, a position of power and privilege in our field and writ large. As a processing archivist at Houghton Library at Harvard University, I work for a predominantly white institution and a particularly well-supported and well-staffed one at that. I want to acknowledge this at the outset of my presentation and explain that I have been fortunate to be allocated time and resources to do conscious and conscientious editing and description, and the institution where I work is currently focused on exploring this. I do want to note, though, that our time is always valuable, and we must always be able to make clear to our employers, to our managers, to our peers, why we are spending so much time on a particular collection or item. And also, before I begin, I want to add that all the images you'll be seeing in my presentation are from the Sunshine State Digital Network, and I'm happy to share links to those if anyone is interested. So that all being said, I'd like to discuss with you all how to approach conversations with leadership, whether that's a direct manager or the head of a library or archives, as well as your peers and colleagues, about advocating for this work and demonstrating its importance, as well as aligning goals and maintaining useful communication throughout a project of this kind. These recommendations have been developed both through my experience and through my research. I think it's important to demonstrate when you're advocating for this work why it takes more time and why it's important to allow it to take more time. You need to recognize that and be honest about it. Because let's face it, it does take more time to do conscious and inclusive description. For me, this has meant that when I was doing some accession level processing, where we typically borrow dealer or donor description and create a minimal NPLP approach to finding aid, instead I'm doing research. I might be reaching out to colleagues who have worked with materials on the subject before, or to peers out in the field who have a specialization in this field, and generally just taking more care than copying the description a donor or dealer has produced. It also might mean that changing problematic description when you find it, changing subject headings, changing material titles, things like that. But in general, it's a bigger project than that. This is an ongoing effort. Inclusive description is an ongoing process. In order to accurately update description, you have to do research. You'll need to gain an understanding not only of the materials you're describing, but also the historical context in which they were created, and be prepared to describe both. It takes time to do that work. It takes time to develop the resources and to reach out to community members in order to collaborate to be able to do that. And this is something that Jessica will speak more about. But during a project, you may want to create guidelines, specific processes, lists of terms, etc., to guide your project and your work. But just to do that, to have the knowledge to be able to do that, and to have done the outreach to be able to do that, takes time. There's a second part to this ongoing process, which means that you have to acknowledge and normalize that we don't know everything. This is an ongoing process and path for the people doing it. As Isa mentioned, this isn't something that has sort of end products. It shouldn't be a goal that is set, but instead it should be recognized as an ongoing and ever-changing learning process. And I think an interesting thing that we don't always think about when considering this work is that archival description has actually always been iterative. People have always kind of thought about it that way. We've always wanted to react to user feedback. We've always wanted to fix mistakes. And this is no different. Inclusive and conscious description is an iterative, ongoing process, just as any archival description should be. This has been something that's come up when speaking to management and to peers. Why do we do this work when preferred language is constantly changing? How do you manage things that you've already edited that you may have to edit again? And my answer to that is just that processing and description has always been iterative. The work we do in archival description, it was never easy. It was never very fast. But it's important to give extra time to make sure that stories are told accurately and appropriately. It does take time to do that, and when you're advocating for that work, you have to make that clear. It also may mean that to do this work, you need more staff. Depending on the scope of your project, you may need additional staffing to complete the work. You want to be prepared to communicate about what they will be doing, how they'll be helping you, why you need the assistance. And while you're having that conversation with leadership about your project, you may also want to communicate that you want to work with people in the community or people who have expertise on a particular subject. And for that, you would like to have funding to pay those people for their time. It is important to welcome different voices and voices from the community to create description that does not oppress or silence. I believe Jessica will also speak about this, but communicating about the approach we should take as writers of description from a humble perspective is important. It may make clear to leadership why funding for community involvement and guidance is necessary. It's also obviously true that not all projects can get this kind of extra funding for extra support, but to do this work, it's important to think about the description process in a more collaborative way and seek the funding if it's possible. So now that we've acknowledged that it may take time, staffing, and resources to do this work, when advocating for it, you may want to just turn to the basic fact of why we do it. Why do we do it? Our users. We aren't doing this work for the sake of it. We aren't doing it to remove offensive language just because, sorry, jumped ahead. Oh, I'm jumping ahead. My apologies, everyone. There's a slight delay. We aren't doing this work just for the sake of it. We aren't doing it to remove offensive language because we don't want that out in the world. We're doing this work because we want to provide accurate description for our users. We want people to both be able to find the materials that they're looking for and also not be offended or harmed when they do find it because of the language that's been used. We want people to see themselves in our collection materials and feel like they're both able to and welcome to use them. We also want to be honest about the history that's impacted people. Reading Jackie Dean's articles about projects at the Southern History Collection, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, it's very clear that some of their reparative work is also just being more accurate in the way we describe people who have had the dominant position in history. White people who have owned enslaved persons should be described as such, rather than seemingly denying that history, hiding it with purely neutral description or ignoring it entirely. This also comes up in my co-presenter Jessica Tai's work. Changing the way we describe historic events, such as the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, is important for the fact of accuracy in and of itself, but also so that those who have a relationship to that history can see it being recognized for what it was, and that the truth is no longer hidden under euphemistic language like internment. There's another side to our users, though. They're not just the public. Our users are also our colleagues, our fellow staff members. It's important to make that clear to leadership as well. Most institutions aim to provide a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere for staff. And when one comes across offensive, problematic language describing someone whose identity one might relate to, whose story might be similar to yours, that is deeply troubling and harmful. I actually think this is an element of this work that we sometimes forget to mention, possibly because of dominant identities like my own, who rarely come across harmful description of people like us, of stories like mine. But it is an issue that we would be remiss to ignore, as would the leaders and managers of our repositories. Finally, and this is also something that shouldn't be ignored, institutions are accountable for the descriptions they make available to users. We can explain away the whys and hows of problematic historic description for as long as we want, but in the end, the institutions who have that description available to users are responsible for it and for any harm it causes or oppression it does. That also means the power to make the changes needs to rest with the institutions. Because they are responsible for this description, they are also responsible for supporting the ongoing process of updating and improving it. On this topic, I would like to recommend that you take a look at my co-presenter Jessica Tai's recent article on cultural humility. She finishes the article with the powerful line, "Real impact is possible when the obligation to incite change falls not just on a few select individuals, but through an organizational culture that values and supports anti-oppressive models of practice." Not only does the responsibility for existing description fall on the institution, but so does the commitment for doing better, for creating more inclusive, collaborative, and ethical description. While all of this is evidence of why conscious and inclusive description is important, information you can take to leadership to advocate for time, resources, and staffing, to edit, and create new description, information you can talk about with your peers and colleagues to make it clear why this work is important, why it's important to take the time. It is also important to make sure that you're setting clear expectations for the work itself and how you'll be communicating about it. When communicating about a project of this kind, it's important to first acknowledge that there will be failures and mistakes among the successes along the way. We don't and we won't know everything. We need to recognize that and normalize that. We aren't experts on every topic, subject, and experience. But in doing this work, we are taking steps towards repairing description and committing ourselves to an ongoing process with this work. We are hoping that we end up with a better product in the end. But again, it's not product-based. It's just about continually doing this work. And as I mentioned before, that's a commitment that needs to be made individually and also by the institution. Throughout a project of this kind, you need to develop and then maintain a plan for communicating progress, the challenges you face, and general updates with leadership. Make sure that leadership understands exactly what the project entails. What are you changing? What are you updating? What are you taking away and why? How are you managing and storing legacy description if you are, and if you aren't, why aren't you? I've also spoken with colleagues who have gotten to the end of a project of this kind and their leadership was wondering why certain subject headings weren't being used or certain aspects of the materials weren't brought out in the description. You want to try to have those conversations early on so that everyone's aware of what will be changing, what will be focused upon, but also keep having them because even if you've had them at the beginning, things may get kind of lost along the way. Make sure everyone stays on the same page throughout the project. And then it's also important to be transparent, not only to leadership and to your peers, but also to the public. Create a plan for documenting and explaining changes for the public and making notes in your description to make clear that changes were made. Finally, to conclude, I'm going to borrow a line from my Houghton colleague and friend, Dorothy Berry. Promising progress, not perfection, serves the difficult truth that problems that took years to create may take years to solve. When you're advocating for the resources one needs for a project of this kind, set expectations realistically. You are aiming to make good, valuable progress. And make it clear that the work will take time, but that it's worth it, and that it's very important for an institution to take this on. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Jessica Tai, and I work as a resident processing archivist at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale. So many of my co-presenters today, as well as in the two previous series, have emphasized the need to be transparent about one's positionality in undertaking this work. I also recognize the importance of doing so and want to start off my presentation by framing where I'm coming from, which ultimately impacts the work that I do. So I identify as a mixed-race Asian American cisgender woman. I'm contingently employed at a predominantly white institution that has allocated the time, resources, and labor to undertake reparative work. So to start off, I'm excited to speak about undertaking reparative archival description in collaboration with communities. I'll largely be drawing from my work as chair of Yale's reparative archival description task force, which is charged with remediating harmful, racist, and oppressive language in Yale's archival description. For our pilot project, which is scoped to remediate collections documenting Japanese American incarceration during World War II, we've been fortunate to partner with two community organizations, Densho and the Japanese American Citizens League. I've included images from each organization throughout my presentation today. So first, why create description standards in collaboration with communities? Dorothy Berry, in part one of this series, emphasized that description stemming from community-preferred terminology is, at the end of the day, better for searching and accessibility. The bottom line is that it's our jobs to have description that enables patrons to discover material. I think this also raises what is at stake if we don't remediate our description. What message does this send about who our collections are really for? Secondly, embracing community partnerships allows for archivists to reverse traditional modes of expertise, therefore disrupting power imbalances that may have previously been at play when interacting with communities. This process involves a lot of investment as well as nuance, which I'll be covering throughout the presentation. So next, community-centered description also pushes back against archival neutrality. Burgess Jules has made the important connection that in the name of neutrality, we're erasing people, communities, and their humanity from the historical record. Opening description to other voices, in addition to making those decisions transparent, is key in decentering the neutral role of the archivist, which Mario Ramirez has noted is often one of presumed whiteness. In a similar vein, attributing value to description created by or created in consultation with communities subsequently attributes value to description created by archivists of diverse backgrounds, and specifically to archivists of color. And finally, there's an argument that can be made for opening up description as a justice-based practice. T.K. Sangwan has proposed a justice-based framework for post-custodial transnational archival partnerships, which recognizes the way community partners enrich the description of our records. And most recently, Tanya Sutherland gave a talk entitled Redescription as Restorative Justice, in which she framed redescription work as inherently reparative, and therefore the work of justice. So a principle that should be central to relationship building with community stakeholders is cultural humility. Part of this is acknowledging that reparative description is essentially reducing harm to marginalized communities, which takes time, effort, and establishing and reinforcing trust with collaborators. A framework of cultural humility is essential in approaching these partnerships. Building upon the concept of cultural competency, cultural humility emphasizes three essential tenets: lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, recognizing and challenging power imbalances, and upholding institutional accountability. As it relates to collaboration with community groups, cultural humility emphasizes the need to develop and maintain respectful and dynamic partnerships with communities, as stated by Melanie Tervalon and Jan Marie Garcia. Part of inviting community input is also about embracing humility yourself, and acknowledging that in the case of collections documenting communities that are not your own, you'll never be able to act as the authoritative voice for that experience. So relinquishing one's traditional role of expert invites a departure from traditionally one-sided partnerships that have historically taken place in libraries and archives. So how do you go about identifying potential collaborators? One way that our task force at Yale approached this question was to ask, who's already doing the work? We identified both the Japanese American Citizens League and Densho based on the tremendous efforts that they have made in promoting and creating resources detailing preferred terminology for describing the experience of Japanese American incarceration. Next question to ask is, how can our institutions support them? How can the work of reparative archival description support their goals and mission? So in the case of our community collaborators at Yale, the aim of their work is to preserve their community's history with an emphasis on promoting justice and human rights. So in our project planning, we wanted to connect our project outcomes explicitly with those missions. Another important part of identifying collaborators is recognizing any potential barriers. So this could include acknowledging that for many community groups, there is an inherent and in many cases justified distrust of institutions. So recognizing one's positionality, especially coming from a predominantly white institution, is critical to disrupt previous cycles of one-sided partnerships. In addition, forefronting your project's guiding principles, such as that of cultural humility, can be a first step in evidencing your understanding that community partnerships take time, investment, and resources. And along these lines, thinking about the way in which you reach out to potential community partners is also an important consideration. For a community group for which you have no pre-existing ties, reaching out to those within your immediate community first can help facilitate those connections. So for example, our task force found it helpful to first reach out to faculty and a recent graduate from our institution who we learned had subject expertise in the area of our pilot project. And from there, pre-existing relationships with community groups were identified, which bridged the gap to us reaching out to those groups. So ensuring collaboration is a mutually beneficial process is related to my earlier question of identifying how institutions can support community partners, but I wanted to take some time to dive into this a little deeper. Firstly, it's important to designate how collaborators will be compensated by looking into what funding is available at your institution. Bets and Ita spoke earlier about advocating for resources, which can include funds for honoraria to compensate community partners. So it's certainly possible that despite advocacy efforts, at the end of the day, internal funding is just not available. So it is important to consider how funds could be procured externally. This could be sought through grants or, as demonstrated by the group Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, also known as A4BLIP, could be approached through a crowdsourcing funding model. Recently, A4BLIP successfully raised over $1,000 through a GoFundMe campaign to pay Black archivists to review the recommendations and annotated bibliography published in their anti-racist description resources. And lastly, if you do come across the case that funds are just not available, think about what else can be offered in exchange. This should be catered to the specific needs of community groups, but could include archival consulting, processing projects, digitizing materials, and digital asset management. So an important step in redescription initiatives is formulating local resources for community preferred terminology. Before this can occur, it is first necessary to identify which terms you will be auditing for. Conducting a collection audit for harmful language can be approached in a variety of ways. Our task force decided to adapt a project-based model that focuses on one collecting scope at a time, which makes sense for the scale of our institution and size of our collections. It may make sense in other circumstances to take a more broad approach to a collections audit. This can be really meticulous, but there are people in our field who have been working on automating this work, such as Kelly Boulding, who presented earlier in the series. Kelly has developed an X-query script to query finding aids to locate harmful language over multiple lexicon categories. And secondly, I'll also encourage you to reach out to staff outside technical services, so especially those whose primary responsibilities entails interacting with users. Gaining feedback from these folks can illuminate reoccurring conversations around specific collections or collecting areas in which harmful language has been identified by users themselves. And another important step is conducting a survey to identify existing preferred terminology resources. I mentioned that at Yale, this was a helpful way to identify potential community partners, but it's also been key in developing the local controlled vocabulary resource for our pilot project, which you can see on this slide. Beyond resources that are specifically scoped on preferred terms, there's also a wealth of research and publications on community preferred language, especially within critical race and ethnic studies. And the next step would be using available resources, feedback from community partners, and information gathered from your collections audit to begin developing your local preferred terminology guidelines. If community groups will be providing feedback on this, it's important to acknowledge and be sensitive to the fact that you'll be presenting them materials that contains harmful language. I also encourage making the process for creating these resources as transparent as possible, finding ways to provide access to public-facing documentation that details your methodology and descriptive choices. This is important both for your community partners as well as your users. And lastly, I'll reiterate the point that many of my co-presenters today in the past series have made, which is that redescription should be approached iteratively. Preferred terminology changes over time, and our description must adapt to reflect that. Building lasting relationships with community groups is one way to ensure the sustainability of reparative description workflows. So meaningful partnerships with communities shouldn't stop when the description is published. Involving community partners and outreach initiatives is another way to continue the relationship building process, in addition to connecting with those outside your traditional patron base. This is a step that we are still working on at Yale, but we've begun to have conversations with our community partners who've expressed interest in being involved in library outreach initiatives, as well as possibly having us share out through their communication channels. We would ensure that they would be further compensated for their participation. An organization that has demonstrated a successful collaborative outreach strategy is the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at the American Philosophical Society, also known as APS. Initiatives have included projects such as the Mellon Audio Project, in which the APS partnered with Indigenous communities to send representatives to work as fellows in the library. So as a result, each community partner provided corrections of inaccurate or incomplete description, provided context for material, and identified culturally sensitive materials. This was just one in a number of outreach initiatives led by APS, which resulted in increased use of approximately 30 to 40% of the collections each year, of which 2/3 of the users came from Indigenous individuals, organizations, or community-based projects. Secondly, I'll emphasize the need to make project resources accessible to other individuals and institutions interested in undertaking reparative description projects. Whether this be through publishing language style guides, making case studies, documenting community partnerships available, or providing access to your local preferred terminology guides. Making the work of your own project visible can facilitate others to begin. It's also important to keep scalability in mind when producing and disseminating documentation. So hopefully the more widespread these projects are, the more ingrained and therefore sustainable they will become across libraries and archives overall. And lastly, I'll add that overall there has been less attention put on outreach in regard to reparative description projects. In order for the impact of this work to be fully realized, I believe that this needs to change. So how can we collectively support further work in this area? I think an important first step is to engage with not just people who create description, but with those whose primary role involves interacting with users. So this will really vary depending on your institution, but could include public services staff, outreach librarians, curators, or even users themselves. Gloria Gonzalez and Jasmine Jones have emphasized that ethical description is assessed by communities beyond those creating the description, so that it can evolve and become a better representation of the materials it describes and be more discoverable across communities. This reinforces the need for undertaking reparative archival description in collaboration with communities. This collaboration should depart from historically one-sided partnerships and center humility in building partnerships with communities that are respectful, mutually beneficial, and disrupts traditional notions of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Itza, Bets, and Jessica for your wonderful presentations. So now we will be breaking up into 3 breakout rooms that you selected ahead of time. We'll be in those breakout rooms for 30 minutes. Each one of them will be recorded, so you won't be missing anything. You can watch the recordings from the other breakout rooms. They'll be posted on our YouTube channel. And without further ado, I will put everyone where they're supposed to be. Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your breakout rooms. I'm sure you were having some great discussions, so I feel bad ending them. But we're all back together now, and I'm going to hand the podium back to Bets so she can close us out, and then we'll take questions.
I think Jessica was actually going to close us out, so I will turn it over to Jessica. Sorry about that.
All right, thanks. All right, so welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone had engaging and productive discussions in their breakout room. So today, Bets, Itza, and I have aimed to provide informative and applicable steps on developing and carrying out projects focused on conscious and inclusive editing of archival description. We hope that today's presentations and breakout sessions have provided a roadmap for you in your journey towards remediating harmful language in your description. And we recognize that this path will look very different based on factors such as where you're starting from, the resources you have available, or the size and scope of your collections. But despite this, we have aimed to provide scalable methods in order to empower you to take that next step. As you move forward, it's important to remember not to do this work in a vacuum. As conscious editing of archival description garners more interest and attention in our field, it will be critical to continually ask, how can we work together as a profession to support redescription initiatives, as well as each other? Whether this be by sharing out resources, offering to consult with institutions taking on similar redescription projects, or presenting findings to a national audience. There will continue to be opportunities to break out of silos in order to learn from each other. We encourage you to take those chances. So with that, I'll conclude our presentation and open it up for questions.
So you can type your questions for our presenters today in the chat box. And I want to take this opportunity while questions come in to thank all three of you again. This was, I think, a great conclusion to our three-part presentation on conscious editing, and I am looking forward to all of the amazing projects and work that is going to be coming from what people have learned in this series. So thank you so much. And Dorothy Berry, our first presenter, is here. And thank you, Dorothy, for your presentation. It's gotten so many views on YouTube. It's great. So again, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can feel free to type them in the chat box. And if no one has any questions right now while we're waiting, I kind of have a question for Itza. So I know that you worked on Spanish language materials as well, and that's something that we have a lot of in Florida. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for how to identify and remediate potentially offensive terms in non-English language materials.
So I worked in trilingual. So I worked with Portuguese, Spanish, and English. I was in Texas, but because I worked in a Latin American library, Latin America is multilingual. And so there's absolutely no reason to have materials primarily or only in English. As far as offensive language, I think that's, in my case, because I was working in another region and within other countries, I think that culturally is just a much different conversation. And also because I worked in a multicultural setting, our collections documented folks in Latin America that either identified as Afro-Latin American, as well as like Afro-national, so Afro-Colombian, Afro-Brazilian, as well as indigenous, as well as mestizo and Ladino. A lot of the conversations that we're having in the United States are not applicable in the same ways to conversations that we're having in other countries. And so I think my biggest takeaway is that we always worked with our partners closely. I actually don't create the metadata. That wasn't my job. I was brought in as a consultant and as support, and we always dedicated not only our funding, but like our attention and our emphasis was that our partners describe themselves, because there was no reason for us to take on that responsibility to describe our, not only our subjects, but also to speak for our collaborators and our creators when they were there. And while we could also pay for them, and that was like a priority of our project, because it's, I mean, talking about not creating mistakes for the future, they know better than I will ever know as to how to describe themselves. And they're also being able to build relationships with them so that we can have conversations around other collections that maybe weren't necessarily created by them, but that they have more proximity to the topics and the subjects in those collections. That allows us to be able to set up the frameworks and the foundation to like do better work in the future. But again, decentering myself as the expert and decentering my institution as the institution that knows what is best as far as description, like that absolutely has to be the first step.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I have tons of questions for you guys, so that's okay.
Yeah, I have questions too for my co-presenters.
You want to go ahead and ask a question?
Sure. This is always my favorite question to ask for metadata folks. So Bets and Jessica, what would y'all say is a good strategy for not falling into the perfectionist hole that is metadata work? I am not a perfectionist, but I struggle a lot with people who want to just think of making everything perfect. So what would you suggest to folks like that?
I can try to take an effort on this. I will admit I don't think I'm actually really a perfectionist, which I think is interesting. I feel like the assumption for those of us who work in metadata is that we will be, but I'm not. And I think in a way that's helped me to be more efficient and decisive sometimes. I do think that that's one of the struggles with being a perfectionist, is wanting to get things so right that you get kind of bogged down in them and can't kind of make the decision of first of all when to stop. I think a strategy for me on doing that has been to kind of, first of all, to like do a lot of pre-work, to do the planning, the kind of the part of this that you actually spoke about, which is like kind of scoping and figuring out exactly what the effort will be, even if it isn't kind of a product-based project. It still needs to be where like I know that these are the kinds of things I want to approach. These are the kinds of things I want to be taking on. And then I'm a big fan of metrics. I try to like kind of keep my own statistics on how long things take me. And that helps me a lot to kind of keep myself on track so I don't end up spending weeks and weeks working on one thing to get it perfect, but instead realizing that I've done more on it than I've done on anything else, and it's probably as good as I'm going to get it. Maybe it's time to either set it free into the world or to get feedback from someone else on it.
Yeah, I think Beth's made some great points. And I'll just add, you know, what we've all said today is to approach this work iteratively. I feel like that helps with not thinking about your work as the final product, but something, you know, infinitely in process. And I think also just assembling, you know, a team of folks who can give you feedback. I'm a big fan of peer review of finding aids or catalog records. So just knowing that, you know, you did your due diligence and kind of making sure that you were hearing a variety of voices before you put that out into the world.
Thank you. And we do have some questions in the chat now. There are 3 archives at my institution plus regular cataloging department. Lots of folks doing the work. I raised the subject of taking it on in our department. My department head thinks this should be an institutional effort. Thoughts on this? So I know Bets and Jessica, you both come from institutions where libraries are very compartmentalized. Do you have any advice on that?
I think what I would say is that I agree with your supervisor on one level, which is like, yes, it should be an institutional effort. But if it's not an institutional effort, I do think that it could be a departmental effort, and that's still a really valid and important project. That's still important work to be doing. And maybe if you can kind of lead the way and lead by example, it might become more of an institutional effort. I understand the inclination that like you want buy-in from the top, but if you can't get that, I still think it's important to try to do, even if it's a smaller number of people working on it.
Yeah, I think that's covered, you know, an important part, and also kind of touched on that taking on these projects at large scales can be incredibly overwhelming. It's, I think, as we all communicated, a lot of work, a lot of time, resources, investment of, you know, staff time as well. So I think that starting sometimes at a smaller scale can be helpful, even in your learning process, because you can kind of look at things in like a smaller scale way, which will help you to think about how that can be scaled up for your institution as a whole.
Thank you. So I'm being cognizant of time. We have a few more questions. Are we okay to take what's in the chat now? Okay, thank you. So for all the presenters, how do you reconcile the trend of MPLP in your work? I'm feeling frustrated by the MPLP expectations.
So I don't know if I'll talk too much about this. I think producing something that is usable, like at a smaller scale, is helpful sometimes. And thinking about, again, like Bets and I might be on the same wavelength of just like thinking that I'm not trying to make this perfect. I'm not trying to do this as completely as possible, because I personally don't believe that me as an individual person is going to be able to do this the best way that it can be. I'm going to do it the best way I can do it, the best way my team can do it. So MPLP in that sense is useful, but I think our field has sometimes fallen all the way to the other side, right? Where we're just doing minimal, just for the sake of doing minimal, because we think that that's going to somehow get us to like finish all of our backlog, and that's not the case either, right? So if you're doing minimal and at the expense of either creating bigger problems for your future for your future team, for yourself, for your community, then the minimal was not the approach that you should have taken, right? And so I don't know if this is going to be necessarily like a good suggestion, because my institution wasn't about minimal. I think one of the biggest problems of doing post-custodial work is because it requires a lot of work, and it requires slow work, and like that's at the core of it. Like there's so much emphasis on building trust with the community that everything else is like extra and a benefit, and if we get it, that's great, but if not, then that's like, that was never the goal. And so it's I think it's just about talking with either your leadership or your team and really thinking about like, if it's MPLP is for you know, like a particular reason, then it makes sense. But if it doesn't have a reason and you're just doing it because that's supposedly like the default way that we should be doing stuff, then I would say you have to challenge that, because I don't even know if MPLP is going to stay around with all these other conversations around doing like slow archiving and really kind of emphasizing on like the richness and robustness of our work, and not necessarily just trying to do the bare minimum.
Yeah, I think Itza has made some really great points and kind of brought up this idea that MPLP can't really be seen as a blanket solution. So my position is within the accession team. I only do baseline processing of incoming collections. So something that I've had to find is that I really need to advocate for when a collection should be considered an exception to baseline processing. And I think that's something that should be forefronted more often and talked about, how MPLP shouldn't be, applied kind of blindly. And also just the point of, if you're going to have to go back and remediate something anyway, then there really isn't, it doesn't make sense to apply MPLP techniques to something that you'll just have to bring back and complete work on in the future.
I feel like Itza and Jessica have answered this incredibly well, and I think made really, really great points. I think one thing I would add, I work at an institution that we have levels for processing, and the baseline is a level 1 kind of MPLP approach. But I think another thing to think about with MPLP is that it doesn't, like, what does minimal actually mean? And making sure that if you do have to work within a kind of minimal framework, that you can still do some work at kind of the collection level with notes and things like that to try to bring out some of the context and some of the information that you might typically want to kind of spread throughout all the levels of description. So I think it is hard when you want to do a lot more, but if you can't get past the point of having to do minimal, I think there's a little bit of wiggle room in what minimal has to mean.
Thank you. What steps have begun for crafting a set of overarching principles, for example, at the SAA level, from which individual institutions may adapt to their local practices, and especially to help reduce conflict over individual approaches and safeguarding relations with the wider community?
So this came up in our breakout room, and I think it's a really interesting idea. I certainly don't know of anything at like the SAA level about this idea. I think it's something that would be really interesting to hear more and to think more about, but I don't know of anything at this point that's being developed.
I would say, and I can't speak to this directly, but I think a good example is the conversations around the Native American protocols. So thinking about not only a community that has been historically misdescribed at the point of just like malpractice by a lot of our fields and practitioners. I think a lot of the conversations that are going around how to implement the protocols, how to work with community, and then just kind of like everything that's like falling out of those conversations is going to be an excellent, I'm so sorry, you're going to hear all the noise outside, but they're going to be excellent examples on how we could apply that to other communities that have been wronged by cultural heritage practices. Yeah, I think they even have like amazing like webinar series. I mean, the protocols themselves are literally instructions, right? And like, how do you work with community? How do you recognize like the wrongs that your institution or your field might be doing to the community still to this day, and not necessarily thinking of just like past wrongs, but how in particular description is still an act of harm that is like not only erasing the existence of Indigenous people, but misrepresenting them in ways that are like gonna impact like their livelihood, their well-being, as well as like their self. That's the one that comes immediately to mind. I think there are others, but I don't know if y'all wanna add any.
Yeah, this actually came up in our breakout room as well, and I think that it is a really interesting idea. I think it's something that would be really challenging, just thinking about how our field occupies, so many different identities, the different types of institutions. So thinking about what would, a kind of national guidelines look like for institutions ranging from a community archive to, like Bex and I's place of work, predominantly white institutions. So I think if we were to approach creating a resource like that, just forefronting, you know, those differences, making sure not to collapse them, and thinking a lot about scalability as well.
I would agree with all of that, and not that this is like a national effort or anything, but I'm going to plug our resource list here as well. We have developed a set of resources that can kind of guide you around this. So there is a lot of literature that's been being produced around this work and strategies, and I think the Archives for Black Lives documentation is really a good effort on like not standardization, but providing solid guidelines for different types of institutions. So just to add that. Our last question is, what are the most important strategies for keeping these long-term projects consistent and to ensure that the ball isn't dropped?
Go ahead.
Okay. My strategy suggestion would be when you bring in more stakeholders, and in particular when you not allow is not the right word, but when you encourage your stakeholders to hold you accountable, I assure you that itself allows you to be consistent when you have not only people keeping track of what you're doing and asking, you know, what the latest updates are, but even just like knowing that you're being held accountable to somebody and you're not necessarily, again, working in that vacuum or doing this work without anyone else knowing what it is that you're doing. That at least allows you to create these kind of like outside strategies to keep you on track. You may still drop the ball. I'll admit to you that that's just something that might happen, but it's really, I think to me, it's more important about what you do after you drop the ball than necessarily focusing so much on that the ball has been dropped, because miscommunication will happen, misunderstandings will happen, things just end up happening. And it's really, if you're doing this for the long term, you have to understand that like you just have to pick it up and figure out what went wrong and hopefully right whatever wrong was done at that moment and then continue.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. And I think it goes back to the, like, this is an ongoing process. And there, I think consistency is important, but I do think that there may be changes as you go through the process as well. And I think a final thing, which is something that Itza brought up in her presentation, is that when you're scoping and you're developing a project of this kind, to make sure that you are supported and actually can have full-time, long-term staff to be doing it, so that when people leave, the work doesn't just stop, the project doesn't end at that point. I think that's a struggle that I think a lot of institutions have, but I think it's something to think about when doing this kind of work.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I would recommend, if you haven't seen it yet, there was an SAA session at the past annual meeting that was focused on kind of transitioning from this work as project-based to programmatic. And I think definitely the point that Bex brought up in terms of, making sure that there aren't just people in contract positions doing this work, but also thinking about how we can kind of integrate these isolated guidelines into our normal workflows that, not just a few select people are going to seek out, but are distributed, across our institution.
I'll also add, I know I wasn't a panelist, but I have opinions. I'll also add that Dorothy Berry gave a really great presentation on labor in archives for the South Carolina archivists, or North Carolina archivists, one of the Carolinas. It's on YouTube, look it up. It's great. I used to be in a contingent labor position. I know that at least one of our facilitators is in a contingent labor position. And I think it's really important. And I think Itza was also in a contingent labor position. It's just really important to ensure continuity and to actually provide funding and invest. So that's where the advocacy comes in. If you weren't able to go to Bets's breakout session, go watch the recording because we really need to advocate for permanent lines and real investment to get this work done by our institutions. So that's my 2 cents on that. So we did have one more question actually, so I spoke too soon. It's a short question, I think. If you don't do it right the first time, when will you have time to do it again? And I'm not sure if that was rhetorical or not, but feel free to answer it if you have an answer.
Yeah, I answered this in the chat. I think I interpreted it very literally, but I just brought up that, you know, and I think at a lot of institutions you get, you know, these correspondence emails from patrons pointing out harmful language, and within your department it's just treated as an emergency situation, and all of a sudden people are being pulled in, and it's something that, you know, is bumped to the top of the priority list. So just thinking about how doing it, you know, right the first time, or at least thinking about a lot of these questions in terms of reparative description the first time will hopefully make it so that we're not running into those emergency situations as often.
Yeah, I like to be generous with my predecessors and pretend that all of them said that, oh, I'm going to come back to this in the future. I know maybe some of them didn't, but I think that it's important to say that if you have the time, you have the expertise, or you can make the time to deal with something now, just do that, because know that there will always be work in the future, and that you're not saving this for someone. Of course, there are exceptions, right? You may not be the best person to work on a particular project. It may not be the best time to work on a particular project. And so waiting for the future is also a strategic approach. But if it's solely because you don't want to do it, that's not a good reason.
I also think that I think those are really great points. I think you both basically covered anything I could say, but I would add that I think there is something to the, like, doing it right. Like, I think the hope is also, like, in generous thinking, hopefully everyone will try to do it right the first time, but you may not get it right. And so also allowing that to be the truth, and accepting it, and knowing that, like, things may come back to you that have to get fixed, or you may come upon them in a couple of years and be like, wow, I did not do my best job on that, and realizing that there are things you need to fix. I think that's also really important in doing this work.
And I'll reiterate that something you guys have said throughout the presentation is that it's iterative, right? So you will need to come back to it. And that's just part of our job. So thank you all again. This was amazing. And I hope that everyone found the series useful. You can find all the recordings on our YouTube channel, and these will be up shortly. So round of applause for all of our presenters, and thank you again so much. I hope everyone has a great December, and we can all say goodbye to 2020 on a positive note. So thanks everybody, and I hope you all have a great day.